Hi, everyone. So welcome. This is a session to discuss MiCA, or Markets in Crypto. I'm very excited to have Ivan Keller from the European Commission and Brian Whitehurst from LUCA to speak about MiCA. So I thought we'd begin first for a question for you, Ivan, which is, what is MiCA? What does it involve? Where do we stand right now? What can you tell us about MiCA?
Sure. Nothing more exciting than discussing regulation before lunch. But yeah, so MiCA is this, really comprehensive piece of legislation that we put out recently. Actually, it's just, it's going to be published, I think, in July. So both the co-legislator, the Parliament, and the Council signed off of it. It's really kind of wide encompassing. So what it regulates is the issuers of stablecoins. So we have kind of two types, the asset reference stablecoins and the electronic money stablecoins. And then we have all the rest of the kind of crypto assets. Then it also regulates the crypto asset service providers. So everyone which is kind of providing these typical brokerage, trading platform services, investment advice services around the crypto assets that are scoped in MiCA. And then finally, we have a bunch of market integrity provisions, which covers basically ensuring that there's low levels of market abuse, so rules against market manipulation, insider dealing, and all of these things that we know from traditional frameworks. So what's going to happen? Maybe to talk a bit process. Yep. Very exciting. So we're going to publish in July, I think, and then there's going to be, it's going to be implemented in two phases, basically. So you're going to have a 12-month phase-in period for the part of MiCA that deals with stablecoins, and then an 18-month implementation period for the rest of MiCA.
Okay, great. So now over to you, Brian. When you listen to this and when you look at MiCA, to what extent do you feel it diverges from what you see elsewhere in the global regulatory environment around crypto?
Thank you for having me here, Julian. Obviously, the global landscape of the regulatory nature of crypto is changing quite a bit from day to day. And in the spirit of AI conversations later on today and being in the UK, I asked ChatGPT to give me a crypto global regulatory breakdown from the perspective of the English Premier League. Just to give a baseline for everyone. So this is what ChatGPT gave me. It said, the UK's regulatory framework approach is like the possession-based football played by Manchester City. The FCA has taken a cautious but progressive approach to regulating cryptocurrencies, ensuring that companies comply with AML regulations while fostering innovation. The US regulatory approach is similar to the direct, fast-paced football played by Liverpool. The SEC has taken a more aggressive stance on crypto, cracking down on ICOs and pursuing legal action against companies that violate securities laws. And China's regulatory approach is like the highly structured, disciplined football played by Manchester United under Sir Alex Ferguson. The country has banned crypto exchanges and ICOs, and the government tightly controls the industry. Japan's regulatory approach is like the intricate technical football played by Arsenal, my personal team. And the country has taken a proactive approach to regulating cryptocurrencies, recognizing them as a legal form of payment and licensing cryptocurrency exchanges. Finally, Switzerland. The regulatory approach is like the fluid, adaptable football played by Tottenham Hotspurs under Mauricio Pochettino. And the country has become a hub for cryptocurrency and blockchain companies with its progressive regulatory environment and favorable tax policies, attracting startups and entrepreneurs from around the world. So, as you can see, a lot of different styles, a lot of different things going on. I think when you compare that to MiCA, MiCA is obviously at the forefront of the industry and being one of the first major jurisdiction that has put out an omnibus bill. I think a lot of the other countries are putting out now consultation reports and examining new perspectives. Personally, I think here in the UK, what they put out in their consultation report is, in my opinion, a what should be the standard of crypto regulation as other countries build out, taking the phased tier approach, because the industry is moving too fast to try to create an omnibus bill that's going to keep up with the industry. So starting with stable coins and then working through other aspects. I think one of the important things for MiCA is how it's able to be adaptable over time to the industry that's always moving. I think it's also interesting, like, to watch Brazil and what comes out of there with their new regulation that will go into effect in June. And while their specific regulator has not been named yet, it's most likely going to be the Central Bank of Brazil. But how they build out their structures and the regulatory frameworks under that bill and the rest of the impact it will have on LATAM, because I think that's a very important jurisdiction for crypto going forward.
Maybe just to add to that, because it was quite interesting to hear these different approaches, and maybe just to add a bit of color of what I think, like, why we ended up being first in line. I mean, it has to do a lot as well with the kind of peculiarity of how the European Union works. And there is this kind of dichotomy of what is regulated at EU level and what is regulated at national level. I think an approach like in the States, enforcement by regulation, and where they have this kind of more sort of regulation by enforcement, and where they have this more flexible definition of what a security is, it's just a more functional definition. We don't have that unified definition at EU level. So I think there was a big concern as well to kind of avoid this fragmentation amongst member states and to put out a unified regime so that it's clear also for the national enforcement agencies how to deal with this delineation between what's a financial instrument and what is a crypto asset under MiCA.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, so would you be able to speak a little bit about, and you've already spoken a little bit about it, but what problems was MiCA trying to solve first and foremost, and what are some challenges that MiCA still needs to solve?
Yeah, I mean, I think MiCA initially was very much kind of focused on stable coins as well. I mean, this was due to the Libra project as well, which prompted regulators into action. And I mean, what's really useful about MiCA is that it establishes this kind of taxonomy of assets where it will be clear for the market how to kind of distinguish between which legislative frameworks they have to operate within. Now, I don't think ultimately that's going to be that simple. I mean, you cannot legislate all the edge cases and cannot hard-code it into law. But this is precisely why MiCA also foresees a lot of kind of coordination mechanisms between NCAs coordinated by our ESMA and EBA, basically, which will enable this conversation precisely about these edge cases. So what is a security under MiFID, or what is a crypto asset under MiCA? So I think that's going to be a very powerful kind of tool to further specify the rules for the market. And I think in terms of what MiCA still needs to tackle, I think it was said many times, we didn't let perfect stand in the way of good. So we really wanted to roll out a piece of legislation that kind of governs all these centralized players in the market. What is MiCA basically specifies in its review clause already kind of like a plan of action, what it will tackle in the future. So within 18 months after entry into force, the Commission should put out a report on various topics. So these include DeFi markets, which is a big topic, NFTs, and lending and borrowing of crypto assets. So basically, these will be, I think, the three themes that we will be grappling with in the next iteration of MiCA. But for now, I think the focus is really on implementation of MiCA, because we have to remember as well that there's a bunch of these level 2 legislation that needs to be adopted in this interim period until MiCA enters into application.
Mm-hmm. Now, back to you, Brian. So, when listening to this, to what extent do you view MiCA as a kind of benchmark for what regulations in crypto should look like? How would you compare it? And are there things that you feel are missing from MiCA right now?
As a benchmark, obviously being the first, it's going to be a benchmark. I think it'll be interesting to watch what the baseline ends up being for all the countries, and how that's implemented, and any differences that some countries more stringent requirements institute, and how that affects everything else. Now, building out from there, I think other countries will ultimately look to it over the course of the next 12 to 18 months to see what is happening, and how they can interplay that with the frameworks they are building out. I do think there are some aspects that could have been better clarified or that need to be examined as countries are building out their individual portfolios. And one, I think, is the valuation of assets. I think MiCA calls for pricing to be disclosed, and it's how are individual licensees pricing those assets, and what are they providing to the customers, and from a disclosure standpoint. I think also one of the big things is data, and how it is going to be, what is going to be required of licensees to provide the data that they are getting to the regulators, and ultimately MiCA, because at Luca, obviously, we're a data company, a crypto data company that has a view of the entire global markets. So if, let's in Dubai, for instance, or Abu Dhabi, for instance, their licensees are required to constantly, for every single trade that happens on one of their licensed exchanges, has to provide all that trade data to Abu Dhabi, their Abu Dhabi Global Markets. However, Abu Dhabi Global Markets only sees that data. They don't have information about what is going on in the rest of the world in the 24/7 market. So they have nothing to compare it to. They can't see any anomalies, any potential for manipulations, anything of the sort. So I think how often that data is required, and that trade data is required to go back to the regulators, and then how it's viewed in comparison to the global market is going to be important for a lot of the manipulation aspects, and understanding what is going on. Lastly, I think from a classification standpoint, I think we need to move beyond, obviously from a regulatory aspect, what is a security versus what is a commodity is important classification. But I think we need to move beyond into a more granular level of how these tokens are functioning and what they're actually used for, and looking beyond just the next 1 to 3 years and what they might be down the line. Again, at Luca, we have a classification system that we developed that is kind of similar to, most analogous to the traditional financial markets of the GICS system. So you're looking at everything that's going on, evaluating the deepest levels. We have 150 different classification systems for every single token, and we break it down to that granular level. So as countries are looking at this and classifying these tokens in a way that is necessary for the market, I think it's necessary to make sure that it's going beyond just, is it a security, commodity, or something more?
So I'd like to probe at that a little bit, and also we're going to open this up to audience questions right after this. So if folks do have questions, we'll open it up shortly. But Ivan, when you listen to that, do you have a sense of what it would take to make these classifications a little bit more granular? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a very much kind of proportional approach with MiCA, whereby we definitely do have, so there are transparency requirements around how assets are traded on trading platforms. So you need to kind of publish your pre-trade transparency and post-trade transparency. There is also an obligation to keep records about transactions. So indeed, if you compare it to MiFID, it's a bit of a different approach in the sense that CASP will not report those transactions, but rather keep it on their systems, with the regulators then being able to basically have a look at what is happening. And then obviously there will be an obligation for, I mean, in terms of just preventing market abuse, there will be an obligation to report suspicious transactions. Now, I do think that's still a very kind of nascent market, so data standardization is definitely something that needs to happen in the second phase if the markets further develop. So I wouldn't be surprised if reporting and data standardization would be a bit more in focus as we move through the future.
So now is a great time to open it up to the audience. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask either Brian or Ivan? Right there, please.
Thanks. Chris Ostrowski from Soda. What do you think we're going to see and when as a result of MiCA? Do you expect to see European banks issuing their own stable coins? Do you expect to see an increase in the volume of crypto assets traded, more actors coming into this space? I assume this could all happen later this year when it comes into effect, but what do you think will be the most noticeable thing to happen and when?
Good question. I mean, I'll speculate, I guess, a little bit, but I think, in a way, I mean, in terms of cash on DLT, I think market participants are going to be a bit spoiled for choice, because, I mean, you do have now a clear pathway to issue stablecoins on permissionless networks. I think that's a very kind of powerful concept. And on the other hand, you do have banks also engaging in the space and working on their versions of tokenized deposits. I think the distinguishing line there is probably that these tokenized deposits are going to be more in kind of closed loop systems, so permissioned systems, whereas these stable coins are going to be kind of open more to these permissionless networks where they look more like kind of bearer instruments. So I think, we're, and there are other as well. So there's the DLT pilot regime that we put out there as well that more caters to traditional market infrastructure. So, and there's a nice link there as well because you can settle within the pilot. So you can settle with tokenized commercial bank money, but you can also settle with electronic money tokens. So, we're very excited to kind of see how market participants are going to approach that, both from the crypto native side of things and then more for the traditional side of things, to kind of get those two legs together, the asset leg and the cash leg, and deploy that on either permissioned or permissionless systems. Obviously, I mean, and that for me is an interesting topic, the question of permissionless blockchains and how they fit into the whole ecosystem. And I think MiCA has made a conscious choice to say we regulate the kind of the trading level, so to speak, or the centralized trading level, but we allow you to kind of plug into the permissionless level. That is obviously a bit more simple when you have centralized players, which basically settle most of the transactions off-chain. I think with DeFi, it's going to be a bit more complicated, and we're going to think these through because DeFi leverages a lot on permissionless networks, both for trading and settlement. And I think going forward, we're going to need a bit more standards around, what are robust permissionless blockchains. And I think that's happening on international regulatory fora level.
Right there.
Tim Massid, question for Ivan. You've described the three categories of tokens under MiCA, and I think it's easy to understand what an asset reference token is and what an e-money token is. Those are pretty specific. As I understand it, the third category excludes anything that's a financial instrument. And financial instrument under MiFID is pretty broad. It's probably as broad as our security definition. Can you talk a little bit about that? And
yeah, there is a bit of a kind of negative scope to that third category of assets. So indeed, it's I think it's defined as any asset that represents a value or a right that's issued on a DLT and then transferred using a DLT. But that is not regulated by MiFID, basically. And I mean, these are, I think these are going to be precisely these a bit more difficult kind of edge cases where the regulators are going to come together and have that dialogue. What is the delineation between, like a security or what is an other crypto assets, as we call them? And I think, for example, these, like what happened with FTX, with the FTT token, that's one of these like edge cases where they call it an exchange token. It gives you, certain rights to have maybe rebates when you're trading in the ecosystem of the exchange. But, there was also this mechanism whereby, its value was tied to basically to the profits of the firm. So I think there, there's going to be an incentive to develop, some more kind of functional criteria as to what is MiFID and what is not MiFID. But again, there are difficulties to that because of this dichotomy of member state law. So basically, securities laws is regulated at member state level, and what is kind of defined at EU level. The good thing is that ESMA is mandated to kind of publish guidelines a bit to specify, what types of crypto assets would be captured by MiFID. So hopefully there's going to be a bit more clarity going forward.
Okay, great. I think we got another question there.
Thank you. Ricardo from GFT, sorry. So do you think MiCA will clearly help regulate the level that electronic money will have of programmability? Because I think that would really help build trust from the beginning. I know that, for instance, that was mentioned, we have been having this discussion that, for instance, the digital pound would not be a programmable money. But yeah, my question would just be if MiCA would regulate that, the level of programmability that electronic money would have. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that like MiCA, with that respect, it remains pretty high level. So it rather focuses on, what are your obligations as an issuer of an electronic money token? How do you, provide the right to kind of redeem that token? How do you manage your reserves in a robust way so that you ensure that peg at all times? And in terms of programmability, I mean, just in terms of regulation, we don't really touch upon that. I think that's going to be very much left to the market to implement, interesting solutions with regards to that. And, I think it's kind of premature to set standards around that, particularly because we've heard from some of the panelists that, it's not quite clear what it means to have programmability of money. Okay, programmability of transactions, we understand, but the latter is still a bit vague. So I don't think the regulation should come in and say anything about that, which in a way is good because it's left to the market to come out with innovative solutions.
And I just want to bring Brian in briefly on this. So when, given the rapid changes in crypto markets, digital assets markets, and frankly, the turbulence of things over the past year, and also the issue of trust that seems to be embedded within that, has that impacted the regulatory environment around crypto?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In the US, for instance, I think obviously what happened with FTX and Celsius and BlockFi and Three Arrows and other things definitely affected the regulations that were being put forth from Congress last year. And there was a step back from how they were actually going to approach putting forth regulation and a reevaluation. I think one of the things that is important to me is continuing to make sure that the vertical integration of a lot of these trading platforms remains intact. I think I used to be at the New York Attorney General's office and did a number of blockchain and crypto investigations. And last week, they put forth a bill in New York State, essentially that would break up the exchanges and the trading platforms, requiring broker-dealers to be broker-dealers, requiring trading platforms to be trading platforms. And I think that is one of the good things about crypto that is necessary to say. Now, we need to build guardrails in to protect. There needs to be clear rules around conflicts of interest, clear rules around accounting, or clear rules around registration, as various aspects have walls where necessary within the company. But I think it's vitally important to make sure is not taken away from this industry. Also, one thing that I think is very important is the approach to tax and accounting and auditing that needs to come out of it. Obviously, you saw with FTX. They were doing tens of millions of trades, hundreds of millions of trades with various tokens, their own tokens, other tokens, and even they are still searching for their assets and figure out where things went and how they functioned and at what point in time they've lost track of them and everything. So again, I think that comes back to making sure you understand the data and keeping a good track on that. And then when you're turning that into auditing and accounting standards, that should be created within regulatory frameworks to make sure that we avoid these situations going forward. Lastly, I think beyond that, I think one of the bigger conversations that isn't taking place that probably needs to is from a tax and accounting perspective on how regulators are classifying tokens versus how tax authorities and accounting standards are classifying them. Because what you're seeing is while the SEC or the FCA or whoever might say, all right, yes, Bitcoin is a commodity. Like the IRS is classifying it as property and it's taxed as property. And that is, so all the different tokens are intangible assets, which have a lot of effects on individual players. So as things are getting used more for purchasing power, if you were to use Bitcoin to buy something with it, while it might be classified as a commodity, tax authorities, that's a taxable event, and an individual person needs to track that. So I think having tax authorities talk to the regulators as they're building out to make sure that there's cohesion between the two is going to be very important. And I think you can even move that over to the CBDC classifications, because as CBDCs become developed, if not written properly, they could be viewed as intangible assets, which then have effects on individuals utilizing those CBDCs for everyday purchases at the retail level. So there's a lot of things that need to get worked out from that aspect.
I want to take one virtual question. We've had Richard from the Central Bank of Liberia write in, and they ask, what are the regulatory frameworks MiCA has with respect to risk management in the crypto market? So that's presumably a question for you, Ivan.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I would say probably like there's two classes then of market participants who have risk management obligations. I mean, there's the issuers of stable coins. And again, there's a lot of rules as to how you need to manage your reserve, what is the composition of the reserve, how do you provide redeemability to customers. And there will be really granular level 2 rules which will further specify all of these things. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is obviously with regards to CASPs, they are on the obligation to manage their risks, and there's a plethora of rules, how they do it. There are governance risks, there are governance rules. Obviously, there's robust conflict of interest rules as well, which are particularly important as you, Brian, said, when it comes to vertically integrated entities, which MiCA in some respects does recognize and allows for. So yeah, and there's a lot of disclosure requirements, obviously, that will help investors in this or users of these tokens to kind of understand what are the properties and the risks of the assets that they're holding.
Great. I think we have time for another audience question right over there, please.
Hassadi from Tradias. One question that was not really spoken about is, while we have a clear classification of crypto assets and stable coins being asset reference tokens and e-money tokens, one of the recitals hides algorithmic stable coins. So how are we going to be dealing with algorithmic stable coins? Are they going to be applying the crypto assets classification of other crypto assets? It's not really clear to me if it's prohibited or not. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the short of it is that they will basically then qualify as other crypto assets because they don't fit, either the EMT or the asset reference token category, and obviously that has consequences. Then, I mean, you cannot market these assets as something that is stable, because they don't follow one of the either categories of rules. So the short of it is they will be allowed, but they won't be classified as stable coins.
I'd like to bring Brian in on that. Any reactions to that question about algorithmic crypto?
No, I mean, I think that's the right approach.
Yeah.
I think algorithmic stablecoins are, there's too many risks there to be classified as a asset-backed stablecoin and should be viewed, I think, more in the form of traditional cryptocurrencies.
Okay, great. Do we have any other audience questions? Right over there.
I think it's an interesting piece of legislation. Could you comment on the operational readiness of the various regulators that will be in charge of applying that legislation, and if there's any mechanisms to kind of share how the legislation is applied in practice between the various regulators?
So I didn't quite get the question. So the operational resilience of?
Readiness, the operational readiness of the regulators.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think from what I see, I mean, the regulators have really engaged in kind of already defining the level 2 standards. So I think there's been a tremendous kind of consciousness that they really need to sink their teeth into this. So both ESMA and EBA are preparing hard, and the way kind of the European Union works is that when you have ESMA or EBA drafting these standards, you have NCAs participating in these drafting teams. So I think, for them, it's also an opportunity to kind of understand and learn about the regulation. And I think 18 months is, plenty of time for them to kind of get up to speed. We should also be aware of the fact that, MiCA also borrows a lot of the concepts from, the existing pieces of legislation. So it's something that regulators are kind of, used to as well. So for example, overseeing market integrity, it's going to work quite similarly as, as how it works with MiFID assets. Also, transparency and some of the reporting requirements are quite similar. So I think there's going to be a lot of synergies there.
All right, well, I think we're running out of time now, so I think we'll close. If there are any final comments from either of you that you'd like to add. Otherwise, I think we can close out the session. I know we have a lunch planned shortly, so thank you all for attending this. Round of applause, please, for our